Hi, we're back here with my 10-inch professional cabinet saw made by Sawstop, and what you see is stock and what you get when you buy the saw, with the exception of this blade. Sawstop give you a blade. This is an aftermarket blade that I've put on here, but they give one that's very similar to that. So let's run through some of the basics and the mechanics of dealing with the blades. First of all, if you're going to change the blade, adjust the blade, or do anything, you need to turn the power off to the saw so that it doesn't accidentally get turned on. And you do that down below, turn it off, and make sure that the power is off. Next, we need to remove this zero clearance insert. And the way to do that is this metal latch, which you just pull up with your finger and take off. And now we've exposed the blade and the arbor, which is what the blade attaches to underneath here. So to mess with the blade, first of all, we have this guard here that we need to remove, and there's a lever underneath that holds that in, and you move the lever about 90 degrees, and then that pulls out. So it goes in and out very simply. Locks and unlocks. So in order to remove the blade, first Sawstop provides two very nice wrenches, and you need two wrenches in order to manipulate the blade. There are two flat surfaces on the inside of the arbor that are the same as this particular end of the wrench. So you put that on there like that. So you now have control of the blade with that. And then this round end of the wrench, you put on the nut that secures the blade to the arbor. Now what we want to do is we want to loosen that nut. And the way we loosen the nut, of course, is to pull it this way. Then holding it still with this wrench, I reach in with my hand and unscrew that nut. Now you have to be careful to keep your hand cupped underneath, because if you drop that nut down into the cavity of the table saw, you're going to have to open up the table saw and figure out where it is among all the sawdust that's down there. So I've now taken off the nut, and then there's a flange that goes over the arbor, and the nut goes against it. And now you simply pull the blade off like that. Being very careful of these carbide tipped saw blades, you can cut yourself fairly easily. And when you lay the blade down, you don't want to lay it on a metal or abrasive surface. Something like that manual would be just fine. Well, the Sawstop is designed to detect when the blade, which is metal, touches other metal or touches the flesh, like your finger or your arm or your hand or something. And when that happens, it detects that. It has a cartridge that comes up and grabs the blade and pulls the blade down under the surface of the saw so that the blade will not cut you. That particular cartridge is a very important part, and when you change types of blades, for instance, a standard blade like I just took off, if we were going to put a dado blade on here, you would have to use a cartridge that is a different size and is appropriate for a dado blade. But let me show you how you remove this cartridge and install it. Down inside here, which we don't have a lot of light, but there is a red lever here, if you can see that. I have my finger against that red lever. I turn that clockwise and pull, and that comes out. Then, using both hands, I pull the cartridge to the right, and it comes out. So this is what the cartridge looks like. Now the cartridge fits onto the saw using this round surface that goes through, hole, and this smaller round hole. This surface right here is what goes next to the blade. And this is what captures the blade and pulls it down if it gets triggered. Putting it back on is a little bit tricky because you have to line up this small hole and this large hole with two round pegs coming out of the mechanism of the saw. And I have found that that takes a little messing around. And then when you get it, you just push those both in like I just did. Then again, we take this red handled pin and it goes into that same hole and gets turned counterclockwise a quarter turn. So now the cartridge, we just took it out and we put it back in. So let me show you this other feature here, which we're going to use in a minute. This yellow Allen nut here is important, and it's important for setting the spacing between the blade and the cartridge correctly. Because if in order for this mechanism on the saw, the cartridge mechanism, to work correctly, it has to be the appropriate distance from the teeth of the blade. And I'm going to show you as we go through reinstalling the blade how to adjust that. But your saw comes with this Allen wrench, and it comes with this device right here, which is really a spacer, which allows you to determine the correct spacing. And the way you adjust the spacing is to put this Allen wrench into this yellow nut and turn it one way or the other, which is just a screw mechanism that moves this cartridge up and down, closer to the blade and further away from the blade. So let's now reinstall the blade that we took off, and I will show you how to check and adjust that clearance. So we'll take the original blade, making sure that the teeth point toward you, because the rotation of the blade comes toward you at the top of the blade. You carefully put that back on the arbor, which can be a little bit tricky because it can get sideways. Then you put this flange on to the arbor first. Then you reinstall this nut. And again, being careful not to drop that down into the saw. But once you get the threads started, it's pretty easy just to do it hand tight. Once we're hand tight, then we'll re-engage both of these wrenches like we did when we removed the blade, and we tighten. Now, you may ask, how tight do you want to make this blade? I will tell you that you do not want to put anywhere near your entire force against these wrenches to tighten it. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be loose at all. So it's sort of getting used to the feel, but do not over tighten it. Now we pull the wrenches out. You probably noticed earlier that I pulled those up from the side of the saw. The cabinet of the saw has a device coming out that you can just hang these on, which is very convenient. So now we've reinstalled the blade. Let's check the clearance of the cartridge. If you can come in here closer, the idea is to put this surface in between the cartridge face and the blade and make sure that there's just enough clearance to allow it to slide through there easily. We can adjust it either closer or further away, which you will have to do depending on the type of blade that you put in there. In this case, I've made it fairly close. And there is a check here sign on the cartridge, which is black, and it's to align with the teeth. So that's all there is really to checking that and adjusting it as needed. What I find is that as long as I'm using a standard 10-inch blade, I have one setting. But when I move to a dado blade and switch cartridges, then I have to do a considerable amount of adjusting to get it correct for the dado blade. And then when I go back to the regular blade, I have to redo that calibration. Once that's done, we can reinstall the riving knife like that and put that lever down, and then reinstall the zero clearance insert and make sure that this metal piece is fully down below the surface of the saw, and then we're done with that. If we were going to shift to a different type of blade, for instance, a dado blade, we would have to switch to a different insert. You'll notice here this insert is cut such that a wider dado blade can fit in there, and so this would go in with a dado blade. So you're probably going to want to own at least 2 of these, maybe more. Now this particular insert is called a zero clearance insert. And the idea, when you first get your saw and get this zero clearance insert, this slit has not been cut. This is a solid piece. And what you do to initialize it is you put it onto the saw with the blade completely down below, like that, and this would be a solid surface of this red material. You would turn the saw on and then very slowly raise the blade to cut that slot. And the reason for the term zero clearance is the idea is that your blade width is obviously what makes that slit, and so there's no gap on either side of the blade. It's right up against that surface. That means that splinters, as the blade is going down through, it lessens the splintering of the wood, both going down through and coming up. That's why it's called a zero clearance. Zero clearance to the left and right of the blade. So now another feature of this table saw, and most table saws for that matter, is that you can adjust not only the height of the blade, but you can also adjust the angle of the blade so that you can make angled cuts. And the way we do that adjustment is a wheel down here on the right hand, from my perspective, the right hand side of the table. And it's this wheel, this handle and wheel right here. And as I turn this handle and wheel, you'll notice that the blade is tilting. And you can adjust it anywhere from 90 degrees to the surface of the table saw down to 45 degrees to the surface of the table saw. So there is there's 45 degrees. That's as far as it goes. And then you can bring it back simply by turning that wheel. And it should come very close to vertical. But we will test that, of course. Put our zero clearance insert back in. And then we'll take a cabinet square, also called a tri-square, and we will make sure that that blade there's no light in between the blade and the edge of this, showing you that it's vertical at 90 degrees. Very important to reset that. So we've gone through the basics here of removing and installing the blade and the cartridge that goes with the blade. And again, the cartridge is there. It's the mechanism that grabs the blade and pulls it below the surface of the table saw if the blade makes contact with either metal or flesh. And we've shown you how to do that. We've shown you how to adjust both the height and the angle of the blade. So as always, if you like what you saw, you like the content, please hit the subscribe button down below and we'll keep you informed of future content.